Sebastian Leinberg stood at the altar of his grand wedding, the soft hum of string instruments filling the air as his guests whispered in anticipation. The estate around him was magnificent, a sprawling piece of paradise tucked away in the heart of the European countryside. The meticulously manicured gardens, the gleaming marble floors, the chandeliers that sparkled like stars. Everything about the event was perfection. His heart pounded with excitement as he glimpsed his bride, Cara Marini, walking toward him. She was everything he had dreamed of, poised, radiant, with a beauty that seemed almost ethereal. Their union promised to be a symbol of power, grace, and sophistication. The future was already in place, meticulously crafted, with no room for anything to go wrong. But as he locked eyes with her, something shifted in the air. A distant hum grew louder, cutting through the melodic tune of the orchestra. At first, no one noticed. The guests were too busy admiring Cara's gown, her elegance. Then the sound became undeniable, a powerful thrum that vibrated through the air. Sebastian's hand tightened on Cara's, and she gave him a questioning glance, her brow furrowing. "Sebastian, what is that?" she whispered. He swallowed hard, trying to conceal the sudden knot forming in his stomach. The helicopter was descending into the garden, its blades whirling fiercely as it cut through the golden sunlight. "Stay calm," he murmured, but even he could hear the uncertainty in his own voice. The murmurs grew louder as the chopper touched down on the lush green helipad at the center of the estate. No one had been informed about a special arrival, and a crowd's curiosity turned to confusion. What kind of uninvited guest would make such an entrance? The helicopter's engine died down, but the disturbance in the air lingered as a figure stepped out. The woman's presence was striking. Dressed in a sharp white suit that glistened against the sunlight, she moved with a grace that immediately commanded attention. But it wasn't just her appearance that captivated everyone. It was her eyes. They were piercing, deep and knowing, like an unspoken challenge. Sebastian's breath hitched in his throat as the woman approached the altar. He recognized her, but it couldn't be. It had been 6 years since he'd last seen her, and everything he had built since then had been to forget her. "Sebastian Leinberg," she spoke, her voice smooth, but carrying a weight that demanded to be heard. "It's been a long time, hasn't it?" His heart raced as his thoughts spun. It couldn't be. He tried to focus, to make sense of the surreal situation. His bride, Cara, looked up at him, confused, but her expression was softening as the woman came closer. Sebastian didn't want to believe it, but the woman's next words left no room for doubt. "Meet your children," she continued, her words slow and deliberate, "the ones you abandoned 6 years ago." For a brief moment, time seemed to stop. The guests were silent, their heads turning back and forth between Sebastian and the mysterious woman. His legs felt as if they might give way beneath him, but he steadied himself, gripping the edge of the altar. The words he had hoped never to hear, the ones he had long buried in the back of his mind, were now being spoken out loud for the world to hear. The woman stood tall, her arms extending to reveal 2 children, no older than 5. Twins, both with dark eyes that seemed to stare right through him. Their gaze was unmistakable. Those piercing, unyielding eyes could only belong to one person. His heart thundered in his chest, and a cold sweat broke out across his forehead. Chiara, standing beside him, was still trying to make sense of the scene unfolding before her. "What is this, Sebastian?" she asked, her voice trembling. Sebastian's thoughts were a whirlwind. His mind was racing, trying to piece together the past. 6 years ago, he had made a decision that seemed like the only way forward at the time. He had married a woman who was nothing like this stranger who stood before him now. He had chosen the life of luxury, the one his family had built, and left behind the woman who had once meant everything to him. Back then, it had been easier to shut the door on her. The marriage, the business, the endless demands of his family's legacy. He thought it would all bring him happiness. But now, as he stared at the children before him, a sickening realization dawned on him. He had discarded them. The woman stepped forward, her eyes locking with his as she continued. You left me with nothing. You abandoned me, Sebastian, and I built an empire from the ashes of your betrayal. But I didn't come back for revenge. I came back to reclaim the truth. Sebastian's legs trembled as he took a step backward, his mind reeling. He had always known that the past wasn't something he could escape, but he had never expected it to return like this. The helicopter, the woman, the children, they were a symbol of everything he had tried to bury. I built something, Sebastian, she said, her tone unwavering. I turned my pain into power. And now, I'm here to show you what I created. You thought I was nothing, but you couldn't have been more wrong. Chiara, still clutching his arm, looked between Sebastian and the woman, confusion and anger rising in her eyes. Who are you? She demanded. What is all of this? Sebastian opened his mouth, but no words came out. He couldn't find the right ones. His mind was still racing, trying to catch up with the gravity of the situation. 6 years, 6 years of hiding, of pushing this woman out of his life. And now she was back, not just with a message of pain and betrayal, but with something far more powerful, the children he had abandoned. The woman smiled coldly, taking a step back, as though she were giving him the space to process the enormity of what was happening. But her expression softened just a fraction, and she spoke once more. I didn't come to destroy your life, Sebastian. I came to show you what I've become. And maybe, just maybe, you'll realize what you lost. And with that, she turned to leave, the children following her, their small hands holding hers tightly. The crowd remained silent, frozen in place, unsure of how to react. Sebastian stood there, his entire world shattering before his eyes. What had he done? What had he lost? Chiara, still holding his arm, looked up at him, her face a mask of confusion and anger. Sebastian, who are they? What's going on? The wedding had crumbled before it even began, and for the first time in years, Sebastian's carefully constructed life felt as fragile as glass, ready to break apart at the slightest touch. As the helicopter lifted off, carrying the woman and the children into the sky, Sebastian stood at the altar, utterly defeated. The life he had built, the empire he had inherited, the future he had so carefully planned, all of it now seemed meaningless. What had he really gained if it had cost him everything that truly mattered? And in the silence that followed, he realized that the price of ambition was much higher than he had ever imagined. Sebastian sat in his study later that evening, the heavy weight of the day's events pressing down on him. The mansion, once filled with the sounds of laughter and the clinking of glasses in celebration, was now eerily quiet. The guests had long since left, their whispers echoing in the grand hallways. But none of that seemed to matter anymore. The reality of what had happened, of who had returned, was all that occupied his mind. He had retreated to his study, hoping that some semblance of control would return to him in the familiar, sterile environment of his office. His fingers traced the polished wood of the desk, the same desk he had sat at for years, making decisions that shaped the course of his life and the lives of others. But now, every choice, every decision felt hollow. The empire he had worked so hard to build seemed like a distant memory, overshadowed by the painful truth of his past. Chiara's presence in the doorway snapped him out of his thoughts. Her face was a picture of frustration, and the look in her eyes was one he hadn't seen before. Hurt, confusion, and perhaps even betrayal. She stepped into the room, closing the door behind her with a soft click that felt louder than any sound in the house. "Sebastian," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I need answers." He didn't look up at first. The silence between them was thick, leaden with the weight of what had just transpired. The woman, the twins, everything about the scene had been a slap in the face. It was as if the past had come crashing into the present, a relentless wave that he couldn't outrun. "I don't even know where to start," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "I never thought she'd come back." Chiara's eyes narrowed, the hurt in them deepening. "Who is she?" And why did you never tell me about her? Sebastian finally looked up, meeting Kira's gaze. The woman in the white suit, the twins, they were all part of a chapter of his life that he had tried desperately to forget. He had buried the past, convinced that if he did everything right in the present, he could erase the mistakes that had led to that dark period. But today, it felt as if everything he had done had been in vain. Her voice softened, but the frustration remained. I don't understand, Sebastian. If you really loved me, if you really wanted this life with me, why didn't you tell me about her? About them. He swallowed hard, his throat tight with the weight of the truth. Because I thought I could move on, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought I could leave it all behind. Her, the past, everything. I thought I could just start over. And I did. I built this life, Kira. This empire, everything I have now. I did it for us. For you. Kira crossed her arms, her eyes cold with disbelief. For us. For me. Then why did you lie to me, Sebastian? Why did you keep this from me? He could feel the anger rising in her, the hurt and confusion giving way to a sharpness that stung. She wasn't wrong. He had lied. He had kept a part of himself locked away, hidden from her, from everyone. And now, that part of him had returned, demanding answers. I didn't lie to you, he said, his voice growing firmer. I just didn't tell you everything. It was easier that way. Easier, Kira repeated, her voice rising. What could possibly be easier about this? About what happened today? About those children? Sebastian's heart ached at the mention of them. The twins. They had been his once. They were his flesh and blood, the product of a time he had tried so hard to bury. He had been young, naive, caught up in his ambition and his need for approval from his family. He had made a choice that had cost him everything. I was young, he said, his voice cracking slightly. I was stupid. I thought if I could just do everything the right way, if I could follow the path they set for me, everything would be perfect. But I didn't realize what I was giving up. Kira stepped closer, her eyes searching his. And what was that, Sebastian? What did you give up? He closed his eyes, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. I gave up love. I gave up family. I gave up everything that mattered for a dream that I thought would make me happy. I thought the wealth, the power, that it would fill the void. But it didn't. It only made me more hollow. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of his confession. Kira didn't speak at first, her gaze softening, as if she was seeing him in a new light. Her expression faltered, and for the first time, he saw the cracks in her own carefully constructed facade. You think I don't know what it's like to chase something you think will make you whole. Kira finally spoke, her voice low, tinged with pain. I did the same thing, Sebastian. I came into this world with nothing, and I worked my way up. I built my own life. And I thought that if I had you, if I had this life, I would finally feel like I mattered, like I was enough. Sebastian looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, he saw the cracks in her story too. The ambition in her eyes, the drive that had pushed her to be perfect, to be everything she thought the world wanted. Maybe we're not so different after all, he murmured. Kira met his gaze, her eyes filled with an emotion he couldn't name. But we are, Sebastian, she said softly. Because you're not just the man who built this empire. You're not just the billionaire who could have had everything. You're also the man who walked away from what really mattered. And I don't know if I can ever forgive you for that. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had spent so many years chasing success, thinking that it would fill the emptiness inside him. But now, as he faced Kira, the woman he had chosen, the woman he had promised a future to, he realized that the thing he had abandoned was the one thing that would have made all the difference. She turned away, her steps deliberate, and he felt a pang of regret in his chest. She wasn't angry, not anymore. She was hurt. She was lost, just like him. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and Sebastian was left alone in the study. The weight of his choices, of his past, pressed down on him. There was no going back. The woman in the white suit, the children, they were part of a life he could never erase. They were a living reminder of the man he had been, and the man he had tried so hard to forget. But now there was no escaping the truth. The empire he had built, the wealth he had amassed, the life he had carefully curated. It all seemed so empty. He had wanted everything. But in doing so, he had lost the one thing that had truly mattered. And now, there was no way to get it back. Sebastian woke up the next morning to the sound of rain tapping against the windows, a soft, rhythmic patter that seemed to echo the heaviness in his chest. The mansion, which had once felt like a fortress, now felt like a prison. The walls, the grand hallways, the high ceilings, everything felt suffocating. He had spent years building this life, surrounding himself with opulence and luxury, but now it all seemed hollow. The truth of his past had resurfaced, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't outrun it. The memory of the woman, the one he had abandoned, lingered in his mind like a ghost. He could still see her standing there, in that sharp white suit, holding the hands of the twins. Her piercing gaze had cut through him, a silent reminder of everything he had turned his back on. He could hear Kara's words from last night echoing in his mind. You walked away from what really mattered. And she was right. In his pursuit of power, in his hunger for approval and wealth, he had lost sight of the things that made life worth living. He had built an empire, yes, but he had built it on a foundation of lies, of betrayal, and of the very people he had discarded. As the rain continued to fall, he found himself staring out the window, lost in thought. The luxurious estate, with its pristine lawns and manicured gardens, felt more like a reminder of his failures than a symbol of success. What good was all of this if it came at the cost of his own soul? He had to find answers. He couldn't let the past continue to haunt him, couldn't let the woman who had walked away from him 6 years ago take control of his life. But how could he undo the damage? How could he make things right? He glanced at the clock and saw that it was already late in the morning. He needed to meet with his lawyer. There were legal matters to deal with regarding his marriage to Kiara. And now, the unexpected arrival of the woman and the children. He had no idea what they wanted, but he couldn't afford to let this situation spiral out of control. He stood up, pacing across the room, trying to shake off the sense of dread that clung to him. The phone rang, breaking the silence. It was his assistant. Mr. Lindbergh, your lawyer is here. The assistant's voice crackled through the phone. Send him in, Sebastian replied, his voice rough, drained of energy. A few minutes later, his lawyer entered the room, a middle-aged man with a sharp suit and an even sharper demeanor. Sebastian had known him for years. He was reliable, professional, but today, even the lawyer seemed like just another reminder of the life he had created, a life that was now teetering on the edge of collapse. Good morning, Mr. Lindbergh, the lawyer said, his voice steady, but with an undercurrent of concern. I take it you've heard from the woman who appeared at your wedding yesterday. Sebastian nodded, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on his chest. Yes, I have. And I need your help. The lawyer pulled up a chair and sat down, his gaze intense. We need to address this quickly, Sebastian. The woman, whoever she is, has a claim. Those children, if they're yours, could open a Pandora's box of legal issues. We need to act fast. Sebastian felt a wave of panic wash over him. I don't care about the legal issues. What I care about is the truth. I need to know what she wants. Why did she come back now, after all this time? The lawyer paused, his expression hardening. It's clear she wants something. Whether it's money, custody, or something else. She's not here just to make peace. We need to be prepared for whatever comes next. Sebastian ran a hand through his hair, frustration building. I've lost everything already, haven't I? I've lost Kara. I've lost my peace of mind. And now I'm about to lose everything else too. The lawyer didn't respond immediately, but his silence spoke volumes. Sebastian had known for a long time that this empire, the life he had created, had come at a price. But he hadn't realized just how high that price was until now. The foundation of his success had been built on a lie, on the abandonment of a woman who had given him everything, and on the children he had never known. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I need to find her. I need to find out what she wants, and why she came back. This is bigger than just me, or Kiara, or anyone else. This is about the truth, and I won't rest until I get it. His lawyer raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He knew better than to argue with Sebastian when he was this determined. Where do I start? Sebastian asked, his voice low, almost desperate. I'll have my team look into her background, the lawyer said. We'll gather as much information as we can, but I suggest you prepare yourself. This could be a lot more complicated than you think. Sebastian nodded, his mind already racing with questions. Who was she now? What had happened in the 6 years since he had last seen her? What had she built in his absence? And most importantly, what had she done with the children? The children he hadn't even known existed until yesterday. He needed answers. As the lawyer left the room, Sebastian found himself standing there, staring at the rain still falling outside. The life he had known was slipping through his fingers, and there was no telling what the future held. But one thing was certain, he couldn't outrun the past anymore. He had to face it. He had to confront the woman he had abandoned, and in doing so, he had to face himself. Because only by confronting the truth could he begin to heal, to rebuild what had been broken. He turned to the desk, his hand resting on the polished wood. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of the decisions he had made. His ambition, his desire for power, had led him down a path that had cost him more than he could have imagined. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to make things right. With that thought in mind, he set his jaw and turned toward the door. It was time to find the woman in the white suit. It was time to reclaim the truth. The days that followed were a blur of endless meetings, phone calls, and sleepless nights. Sebastian had always been a man who thrived under pressure. His sharp mind and relentless drive had helped him build an empire. And he had convinced himself that he could control any situation, no matter how complicated. But this, the return of the woman from his past, the revelation of the children he never knew, this was beyond anything he had ever faced. The information his lawyer had gathered about her was sparse but unsettling. The woman's name was Veronica Hart, and she was a self-made entrepreneur who had built a successful business empire in the tech industry. She had started from nothing, literally nothing. Raised in foster care, she had fought tooth and nail to claw her way to the top. Her rise had been meteoric, and now she was one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in Europe. But what had struck Sebastian the most was the revelation about the children. The twins, Sophia and Leo, were now 6 years old, and they had been living with Veronica in a secluded estate not far from Lindbergh's own. Sebastian had no idea how she had managed to keep them hidden from him all these years, or why she had never reached out. Had she been waiting for the right moment? Had she been planning this return all along? He couldn't stop thinking about the look on her face when she had stepped out of that helicopter. She wasn't angry, not really. It wasn't vengeance that drove her. It was something else, something deeper, something that even Sebastian couldn't fully understand. It was as though she had built herself into this formidable force of nature, and now she had returned to claim something that had been taken from her. But what was it? Was it justice? Was it closure? Or was it something else entirely? Kiara had been distant since the wedding. He hadn't expected her to forgive him, not after everything that had happened. She had every right to be angry. But the silence between them was suffocating. It wasn't just the absence of her presence, it was the absence of trust, the void that had grown between them. Every time he saw her, it felt like there was something unspoken, something that hung in the air, too painful to address. Sebastian knew he had made mistakes. He had always been driven, always focused on his goals. But now, as he sat in his office, staring at the photographs of his family that decorated the walls, he realized just how much he had sacrificed. His ambition had driven him to chase success at any cost. But in doing so, he had hurt the people who had truly mattered. He had walked away from Veronica, from the children, his children, and he had never looked back. And now, the consequences of that choice were staring him in the face. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He couldn't keep running from this. He needed answers. He needed to face Veronica, to understand why she had come back into his life now. He needed to know what she wanted from him. And more importantly, what she planned to do next. Sebastian made up his mind. He was going to visit her. The drive to her estate was long and quiet, the only sound the hum of the engine as it sped down the winding roads. As they approached her estate, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease settle in his stomach. This wasn't a simple confrontation. It was the beginning of something much bigger, something that would change everything. When he arrived at the gates of her estate, he was greeted by tall, iron fences that loomed over him like sentinels. The estate itself was impressive, an imposing structure of glass and steel, surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens. It was the kind of place that screamed success, that screamed power. And yet, there was something about it that felt cold, distant. Veronica's housekeeper greeted him at the door and led him through a series of spacious, modern rooms. The house was stunning, but it felt sterile, almost clinical. Everything was perfect, but it lacked warmth. There were no personal touches, no family photos, no mementos of a life well lived. It was as though Veronica had built this house not to live in, but to hide from the world. And then she appeared. Veronica stood in the doorway of the living room, her presence commanding. She had changed since he last saw her. She was no longer the young woman who had once been naive enough to fall in love with him. Now she was powerful, self-assured, and there was an undeniable strength in her gaze. She had built her empire, and she wore it like armor. "Sebastian," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I didn't expect you to come here. But then again, I suppose I should have." He took a step toward her, unsure of what to say. "I need to understand. Why now? Why come back after all these years?" Veronica studied him for a moment, her eyes searching his face, as if looking for something he couldn't offer. "You don't understand, do you?" she asked softly. "You never did. You thought you could just walk away from everything and move on. But life doesn't work that way, Sebastian." He felt the sting of her words, but he didn't flinch. "What do you want from me? Why did you bring them here? Why did you bring the children?" A flicker of emotion crossed her face, but it was quickly masked by a calm exterior. She motioned for him to sit. "Have you ever wondered, Sebastian, what would have happened if you hadn't left? What if you had stayed? What if we had built something together, something real?" Sebastian sat down, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never thought about it that way. He had always believed that leaving her was the right decision, the necessary decision. But as he looked at her now, he realized how much he had underestimated her strength, her resilience. And for the first time, he wondered what his life would have looked like if he had made a different choice. "The twins," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "Are they really mine?" Veronica's eyes softened for the briefest moment. "Yes, they are," she said, her voice tinged with both pride and sorrow. "They're yours, and they deserve to know who you are, Sebastian. They deserve to know their father. But more than that, they deserve to know the truth. And that's why I came back. I came to give them that." Sebastian's mind spun. The weight of her words was too much to process all at once. The twins were his. They were his flesh and blood, and he had no idea who they were. He had no idea what they had gone through, what Veronica had gone through in raising them alone. And as he sat there, staring at the woman who had once been everything to him, he realized something else, something far more profound. This was not just about the children. This was about him. About the choices he had made, the life he had chosen. and the life he had lost. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice barely audible. Veronica didn't respond at first, her gaze distant as though she was weighing his apology. "Sorry isn't enough, Sebastian," she said, "but maybe it's a start." And just like that, the door to the past was opened. There was no turning back now. The days after Sebastian's meeting with Veronica were filled with a strange sense of anticipation. Each morning, he awoke with a renewed sense of urgency, as though something inside him had shifted, but he wasn't yet sure what. The estate that had once been his sanctuary now felt empty, despite the bustling staff and the endless distractions of his high-powered life. The weight of the truth hung over him like a thick fog. He had always believed that his success, his wealth, and his power could shield him from the consequences of his actions. But now he realized that no amount of money could change what had happened. No business deal could erase the choices he had made. He couldn't stop thinking about Veronica, how she had stood there, calm and composed, while everything in his world seemed to crumble. She wasn't just there to confront him. She was there to reclaim something that had been taken from her. And in doing so, she had shown him just how much he had lost. Sebastian had spent the past few years surrounded by luxury. Private jets, penthouses in every major city, designer clothes, and all the material trappings of success. But none of it had ever brought him the peace he had been looking for. He had been chasing something he couldn't define, never realizing that the very things he had abandoned were the ones that could have given him a sense of fulfillment. Veronica, the children, even Kiara. These were the people who had once mattered most to him. And now, they were the ones who seemed to hold the key to his redemption. Over the next few days, Sebastian began reaching out to the few people he still trusted. He contacted old friends, business partners, and even some family members to ask about Veronica, about the life she had built. He wanted to know everything he could about her, every detail he had missed during their time apart. What kind of woman had she become? What kind of mother was she to the twins? What had driven her to return now, to bring those children into his life when everything seemed so fractured? What he learned surprised him. Veronica had become a powerhouse in her own right. After leaving him, she had poured herself into her business, building a technology company from the ground up. She wasn't just some woman scorned seeking revenge. She had become a leader in her own right, respected by both her peers and her competitors. And yet, despite her success, there was a certain vulnerability to her, a quiet sadness that seemed to cling to her, no matter how much she tried to hide it. As for the twins, they were nothing like the children Sebastian had expected. They weren't the angry, rebellious kids he had envisioned, ready to confront him with all the resentment they must have felt for him abandoning them. They were smart, sweet, and, above all, curious. They had questions, and they weren't afraid to ask them. And in their eyes, he saw something that both terrified and exhilarated him: the possibility of redemption. It wasn't just about being a father to them. It was about being a better man. The realization was sobering. Sebastian had spent so much time and energy trying to be someone he wasn't, trying to fit into a mold of success that had nothing to do with what really mattered. And now, as he looked at the fractured relationships around him, he understood what had been missing all along. But even as he began to confront his past, the fear of what the future held loomed over him. Veronica wasn't just asking him to play a part in the twins' lives. She was demanding that he face the truth, that he acknowledge the cost of his decisions. She wasn't going to allow him to pretend that everything was fine, that he could continue living in his world of carefully curated illusions. In the following days, he found himself becoming more restless. He couldn't escape the thought of Veronica and the children. He couldn't escape the knowledge that they were out there, living lives that he wasn't a part of. And every time he closed his eyes, he could see the look on their faces, the shock, the disappointment, the unspoken words. His lawyer had warned him to tread carefully, that the situation could quickly spiral into a legal nightmare, with Veronica demanding custody or making claims against his fortune. But to Sebastian, that wasn't the issue. The real issue was something far deeper. How would he face the people he had abandoned? How could he make up for the years lost? Sebastian found himself sitting in his office late one evening, the glow of his desk lamp the only light in the room. He was exhausted, mentally and physically, but his mind wouldn't stop racing. What had driven him to make the choices he had? What had kept him from doing the right thing all those years ago? In the quiet solitude of his office, the weight of his regrets became almost unbearable. He thought of Veronica, standing in that sharp white suit, her piercing eyes unwavering as she spoke of the life she had built without him. She wasn't angry. She wasn't vengeful. She was simply stating a fact. He had abandoned her, and he had abandoned their children. But Veronica hadn't come back to punish him. She had come back to give him a chance to do what he should have done all those years ago, to be a part of their lives, to make things right. Suddenly, his phone rang, breaking the silence of the room. It was Kiara. "Sebastian," she said, her voice tight. "I've been thinking about everything. About us. And about what happened with Veronica." He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the conversation he knew was coming. "I know you're angry, Kiara, and I don't blame you. But I'm trying to make things right. I'm trying to fix the mess I made." "I don't know if that's possible," she replied softly. "But I do know this. You've lost something. Something that can't be replaced. I'm not the one you need to fix things with. It's them. Veronica. The kids. They're the ones who deserve you, not me." Her words stung more than he had expected. He had known, deep down, that Kiara wasn't the person he needed to fight for. But hearing her say it out loud, hearing her acknowledge that he had lost something far greater than her, hit him harder than anything else. "I know," he whispered, his voice raw. "I know." The conversation ended on a quiet note, but it was enough to send him into a spiral of reflection. Kiara was right. His focus had always been on climbing the ladder of success, on proving himself to the world, to everyone around him. But in doing so, he had alienated the people who had truly mattered, the people who had loved him unconditionally. He thought of the twins once more, Sophia and Leo, and the deep, unspoken bond they shared with Veronica. She had done the impossible. She had built a life without him. But she had done it with grace, strength, and a resilience that he had never truly understood until now. And now he had to find a way to become a part of that life. But could he change? Could he truly become the man he needed to be, not just for Veronica and the children, but for himself? The answer, Sebastian realized, wasn't as simple as he had hoped. But he wasn't ready to give up just yet. Something in him had shifted, and for the first time in years, he felt the weight of possibility. And with it, the hope that he could still make a difference. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be quick. But the journey was just beginning, and Sebastian knew that it was one he had to take. He couldn't undo the past, but he could shape the future. And that was all that mattered now. Sebastian's journey had just begun, and yet it already felt like the weight of the world was pressing down on his shoulders. Each day that passed brought with it a new layer of realization, a deeper understanding of the consequences of his choices. He had spent so many years building a life of wealth and power, but none of that could shield him from the truth. He had abandoned the people who had truly mattered. The days stretched into weeks as he continued to meet with his lawyers, navigating the complex legalities of custody, visitation, and the life that Veronica had built in his absence. But no matter how many documents he signed or strategies they discussed, none of it could fill the empty space he felt inside. Every step he took toward rectifying the situation felt like a hollow victory. There was so much more at stake than the legal battle. It was about his soul, his redemption, and the chance to rebuild relationships that had been shattered. Veronica had made it clear from the start. She wasn't interested in revenge. She had no desire to bring him down, to make him suffer for the past. She had come back to reclaim what was rightfully hers, to offer him a chance to be a part of the children's lives. But she wasn't going to hand that chance to him easily. She had done what she could to protect her children, to ensure they had everything they needed to thrive, despite the absence of their father. She wasn't going to let him waltz back into their lives just because he had finally realized the magnitude of his mistake. And yet, despite her reservations, there was something in Veronica's eyes that told Sebastian she was willing to give him a chance. It wasn't an open invitation, but there was an opening, a crack in the door. But he had to prove himself, not just to her, but to the children and to himself. The first meeting with the twins had been nothing short of overwhelming. Sebastian had expected anger, or perhaps cold indifference, but what he found instead was cautious curiosity. Sophia and Leo weren't the children he had imagined in his mind. Angry, resentful little souls who had been scared by his absence. They were bright, inquisitive, and filled with questions. Sophia, the older of the two by a few minutes, had asked him a question that would haunt him for days. Why didn't you want to be with us? The simplicity of her question, the purity in her voice, was enough to pierce through his hardened exterior. How could he answer? What could he say to explain the years of neglect, the lies he had told himself, and the excuses he had clung to? He had no real answer for her, nothing that would make sense to a child so innocent, so full of potential. He could only look into her eyes and hope that somehow his presence would be enough to bridge the gap. Leo, her twin brother, had been quieter, watching Sebastian with a mixture of skepticism and wonder. His eyes were full of questions, but his silence spoke volumes. He was the quieter one, the observer, always watching from the sidelines before making his move. Sebastian could feel the weight of his gaze, and it made him uneasy. Leo was the one who would test him, who would take longer to warm to him, and who would need more time to believe that he was truly there to stay. Veronica watched them closely, her posture stiff and guarded. She wasn't going to let him get too comfortable. She wasn't going to let him believe that he could simply waltz back into their lives and everything would be fine. She had built this life without him, and while she might have opened the door a crack, she wasn't going to throw it wide open until she saw that he was willing to fight for it. Sebastian understood that. He knew that he had to earn his place back in their lives. He had to prove to them, to Veronica, and most importantly, to himself, that he was capable of being the man they needed him to be. He couldn't undo the past, but he could start making better choices now. He could show them that he was committed to being there for them, no matter what it took. The days that followed were a blur of moments, small victories and crushing defeats. Sebastian found himself sitting in the same rooms as the twins, listening to them laugh, to their innocent questions about the world, and he couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. He had missed out on so much. Years of their lives, years that could never be reclaimed, had slipped through his fingers. But he wasn't going to let that stop him. He would fight for them. He would fight for Veronica, too, if she would let him. But even as he took these steps, he knew it wasn't enough to simply be present. He couldn't just show up and expect things to fall into place. He had to change, and that was the hardest part. Change didn't happen overnight. It wasn't something that could be faked or rushed. He had to dig deep, to confront his own demons, to understand why he had made the choices he had. He had to unlearn the habits and mindsets that had led him to prioritize success over family, over love. The first breakthrough came when he was sitting with the twins one afternoon in their living room. They were playing a game, their laughter filling the room, when Sebastian found himself lost in a moment of clarity. He had always thought that he had to be perfect, always on top, always in control, always the one with the answers. But in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of their laughter, he realized something fundamental. Perfection wasn't the goal. Love was. And love wasn't about being flawless. It was about being there, showing up, and giving your all, no matter the obstacles. It was a revelation that changed everything. Sebastian began to spend more time with the children, learning about their likes, their dislikes, their hopes and dreams. He wasn't trying to force a relationship. He was simply being present. He listened to their stories, played with them, and shared in their joys. Slowly but surely, he began to feel something he hadn't felt in years. Connection. Real, raw, unfiltered connection. He wasn't just a father in name anymore. He was becoming a father in action, in spirit. But the road to redemption was never going to be smooth. There were setbacks, moments of doubt and uncertainty. Veronica was still cautious, still hesitant to fully embrace the idea of him being a permanent part of their lives. She wasn't ready to forgive him, not completely. She needed time. And yet there were small signs of progress. One evening, as they sat together after dinner, Sophia looked up at him with her wide, innocent eyes. "Are you going to stay?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The question was simple, but it held so much weight. It was the question that he had been dreading, but it was also the question that he had been hoping for. It was a question that demanded an answer, a commitment. "I'm here, Sophia," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." It was a promise, one that he would do everything in his power to keep. But even as he made that promise, he knew that it wasn't just words that would make the difference. It was the actions that followed, the love he showed, and the consistency with which he proved himself to be worthy of their trust. The next morning, Sebastian made a decision that would shape the course of his future. He would step away from his business for a while. He would dedicate himself to being a father, to rebuilding the family he had lost. He wasn't sure where it would lead or how long it would take, but for the first time in years, he felt that he was on the right path. As he looked out the window of his office, the sun rising over the city, he knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid, because in his heart, he understood that the true measure of success wasn't found in wealth or power. It was found in the relationships we build, in the lives we touch, and in the love we give. Sebastian had lost so much, but in that moment, he knew that he still had the chance to make it right. And that was all that mattered.